The life Baruch never planned. He grew up in Jerusalem, in a family with standing. His brother would later serve in the royal administration under King Zedekiah. Baruch himself was educated, trained as a scribe, a skill that often placed a man within the circles of government and leadership. For a young man in Jerusalem, that kind of background usually pointed toward a predictable future, a respectable career, stability, a life connected to the administration of Judah. Baruch may have expected something like that for himself. Instead, his life became tied to a prophet named Jeremiah, and from that moment forward, the future he may have quietly imagined began to slip out of reach. Jeremiah was not a man welcomed in the halls of power. He was a man who stood outside them, calling a nation to account. His message did not promise stability. It warned of judgment. It spoke of a kingdom that was beginning to fracture from within. Even as threats gathered from beyond its borders, Baruch did not just hear those words, he wrote them. Then Jeremiah called Baruch the son of Neriah, and Baruch wrote on a scroll at the dictation of Jeremiah all the words of the Lord that he had spoken to him. Jeremiah chapter 36, verse 4. At first, it may have felt like meaningful work, important work, the kind of work that carried weight and purpose. But it did not remain safe. Jeremiah was no longer permitted to enter the temple. So Baruch was sent in his place. He stood where the people gathered. He unrolled the scroll, and he read the words aloud. Words that confronted, words that warned, words that exposed what many would have preferred to leave hidden. The message did not stay in the temple. It made its way into the royal court. And one day, Baruch's words were read before the king of Judah. As Jehudi read 3 or 4 columns, the king would cut them off with a knife and throw them into the fire. Jeremiah chapter 36, verse 23. Piece by piece, the scroll disappeared into the flames. The work Baruch had carefully written was reduced to ashes in front of the throne. It is not hard to imagine how quickly everything changed in that moment. This was no longer just writing. This was no longer just association. The king ordered both Jeremiah and Baruch to be seized. Baruch was no longer a man with a promising future in Jerusalem. He was now aligned with a message the king wanted silenced. And the cost of that alignment was no longer theoretical. It was real. Day after day, Baruch remained close to Jeremiah, close enough to hear the words before they were spoken, close enough to see how people responded, close enough to witness the strain of carrying a message that few were willing to receive. It is one thing to be told that a calling will be difficult. It is another to stand close enough to watch what it costs. And over time, what Jeremiah carried was no longer something Baruch observed from a distance. It became something he began to feel himself. At some point, the weight became too much to carry quietly. Woe is me, for the Lord has added sorrow to my pain. I am weary with my groaning, and I find no rest. Jeremiah chapter 45, verse 3. Those words do not sound like a man standing at the beginning of a promising future. They sound like a man who has begun to realize that the life he once expected is no longer in front of him. And in that moment, the Lord spoke to Baruch personally. Do you seek great things for yourself? Seek them not. For behold, I am bringing disaster upon all flesh, declares the Lord. But I will give you your life as a prize of war in all places to which you may go. Jeremiah chapter 45, verse 5. The words are direct, but they are not harsh. They are honest. The world Baruch once understood was about to collapse. The systems he may have trusted, the paths he may have expected to follow, the stability he may have assumed would be there, none of it would remain untouched. In a moment like that, great things begin to look very different. God did not promise Baruch recognition. He did not promise him influence. He did not promise him the life he may have once imagined. He promised him something far more basic, his life. And in a time when nations were falling and cities were burning, that was no small promise. Baruch was left with a choice. He could step away from the path that had brought him sorrow, or he could remain. Scripture does not record a speech. It does not describe a turning point with dramatic language. It simply shows us what Baruch did. He stayed. The scroll was written again. The message continued. The words that had once been cut apart and burned were preserved. And long after the kings who rejected them were gone, those words remained. because a man who once felt overwhelmed chose to remain faithful. Baruch's life did not unfold the way he may have planned, but the role he quietly fulfilled became part of a story far greater than the one he may have imagined for himself. And we are still reading those words today. As we sit with Baruch's story, we may find that it reaches closer to our own lives than we expected. We often begin with a picture of what our future will look like. The direction seems clear, the path feels stable. But sometimes the road shifts, opportunities change, expectations fade, and we find ourselves walking a path we would not have chosen. Baruch reminds us that those moments are not the end of the story. Sometimes the life we would not have planned becomes the place where faithfulness quietly takes root. And in ways we may not see at the time, that faithfulness becomes part of something much greater than we imagined. As you sit with this today, consider where your expectations for life may have shifted. Where has the path become different from what you once thought it would be? And in those places, where might God be inviting you not to step away, but to remain? If you're willing, share your reflections or questions in the comments so we can learn and walk this journey together.